Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This is going to be a slightly odd episode of Stars and Swords because I'm starting to feel some kind of malevolent presence here associated with the podcast. I'm starting to feel as though we may have awakened some kind of, I don't know, Eastern European curse. Because this week, for the second time in over 100 live episodes that I've ever recorded, using the YouTube platform, for only, I think, the second time ever, YouTube just ate a live broadcast. The video just disappeared after the fact. I know a couple of people managed to see the live broadcast as it was going out, or at least parts of the live broadcast as it was going out, but that video is gone. And that means that I have to re-record the entire thing, which is going to be a weird sensation because for me, we've already had these conversations, but for you, we haven't. So forgive me if I'm a little more scattered than usual as I'm trying to navigate this. I'm also recording this at the completely unprecedented time of noon on a Wednesday, which feels, I'm not going to lie, a little weird. I don't have my traditional glass of wine here to keep me company as we move through the podcast proceedings, but I'm going to do my best to make this feel like, hey, any regular episode of Stars and Swords in which we are definitely not cursed by the malevolent presence of the vampire. This week, we are going to finally leave behind Transylvania, and we are going to meet our supporting cast. We are going to meet Mina and Lucy and Dr. Seward. We're going to meet, a cowboy. Because what does every gothic vampire novel need more than a cowboy? I have no idea. We're going to meet all of these characters and really lay, I think, the rest of the framework for our understanding of Dracula. After this week, the pace, I promise you, will pick up because really we're doing so much scene setting at this point and establishing so many of the motifs, so many of the thematic conflicts, so many of the structural elements that we're going to rely on later. And of course, just a ton of characterization. That's really where our focus is going to be in this week's episode. And that's going to be great. That's going to be fun because, as I've said before, Bram Stoker has an oft overlooked mastery of voice. In the course of tonight's reading, we are going to get 5 clear, crisp, different voices, all of which I think sing, and I'm only really attributing there the authors of the various documents that we're going to be reading, because we also get a couple of other people who are presented to us indirectly, and those voices are every bit as clear, and that's really a titanic achievement. It's very easy, I think, when you settle into the first 4 chapters of this book to understand that Harker is, as he is often misconstrued as being, just the voice of the author, that this is Bram Stoker's voice, and this is his default mode of interaction, and that I think is untrue. We're going to be looking, in fact, with a great deal of care and subtlety at how Stoker presents characters and how those characters can change, how they can be transformed. We started this. In fact, let's get into our first line, which will, because I am me and this is our way, this will take us back to Transylvania, of course. So we're going to cover this very quickly. I've excerpted 3 short clips here from previous chapters so that we can look at how Harker conveys his own sense of his situation in the world. And I'll footnote this too by mentioning again how he changes over the course of those 4 chapters, right? We talked last week about his hardening heart, particularly when he's surveying the mother of the child who is taken by Dracula and presented to the vampire brides, right? When he's looking down on that woman in the courtyard as she is torn apart by wolves, his heart does not seem to be the generous, open thing that it was at the beginning of the novel. We can speculate to what degree that is the influence of Dracula himself, to what degree that is the influence of the vampiric feeding that is presumably occurring by that point, or to what degree it's simply something to do with Castle Dracula itself, or something more abstracted from the figure of Dracula himself, right? Well, we'll talk a little more about that as we approach the end of today's reading. So these 3 examples I have chosen because, as you can see from the bolded passages, sometimes Harker says things which aren't true or which require a leap of speculation or which stand contrary to his own experience. From chapter 2, we have this quote, I have only the Count to speak with, and he, I fear I am myself the only living soul within the place. Let me be prosaic so far as facts can be. It will help me bear up, and imagination must not run riot with me. If it does, I am lost. Let me say at once how I stand, or seem to. End quote. I fear I am myself the only living soul within the place. So here we've seen a kind of dramatic irony, right? Because Harker asserts something that is broadly, to our understanding of the novel, true, that he is in fact the only living soul in the place. But he gets there without working through the rational process. He gets there without really understanding the reasons why he would say such a thing, and then chastises himself for that, right? Let me be prosaic let me be prosaic so far as facts can be. It will help me to bear up, and imagination must not run riot with me. He is so much the rational Victorian gentleman that he's ignoring this true intuition, right? This is not, to go back to our previous discussions of epistemology, right? This is a true belief, but it is not a justified belief, so he rejects it completely. Let's move on to the second passage here, taken from chapter 4. Quote, I am sure this diary would have been a mystery to him, which he would not have brooked. He would have taken or destroyed it. As I look around the room, though it has been to me so full of fear, it is now a sort of sanctuary, for nothing can be more dreadful than those awful women who are waiting to suck my blood. Here again, a point of speculation from Harker. This is right after his first encounter with the vampire brides, of course. Waiting to suck my blood. If we go back and we look at what he experienced, we might not immediately jump to, if we did not have the century of Dracula-infused vampire lore that we have here in 2024, if we were more innocent and more new to the experience of vampires, we might not immediately jump to waiting to suck my blood. All the talk of the vampire brides was of kissing. There was the feel of the teeth upon the neck, for sure, but I'm not sure that I would immediately jump to the sucking of blood, right? That very specific terminology, the sucking of blood, not the drinking of blood or the consumption, but this very specific vampire-oriented terminology. I'm not sure that I would jump to that as freely as Harker jumps to it, but here it's crisp, it's clear, and it's true. Again, this true, though not possibly justified, belief. How is he getting there? Is this his imagination? Is this some deeper layer of understanding that is in conflict with his rational Victorian mind? Let's look at the third example here, too. It has always been at night time that I have been molested or threatened or in some way in danger or in fear. I have not yet seen the Count in the daylight. Can it be that he sleeps when others wake, that he may be awake whilst they sleep? If I could only get into his room, but there is no possible way. The door is always locked. No way for me. This also, of course, from chapter 4. I have not yet seen the Count in the daylight. Except, of course, for that time that he came in and smashed my shaving mirror, where the Count says, good morning. We assume that Harker would have risen with the dawn, and or if not later, given the late hours that he's keeping here in the company of the Count in Castle Dracula. And also, of course, there are no electric lights in Castle Dracula. There are no, artificial sources of illumination. So in order for him to shave, particularly using a small shaving mirror, we should probably infer the presence of daylight, which means that there was a time that he saw Count Dracula in the daylight, and he is backfilling his own memory. He is becoming less reliable, and of course, the idea of memory itself being unreliable is of extreme interest in this epistolary novel, where the documentation itself has been praised for its forthrightness and its reliability, right? That's what the author's note tells us. There can be no weakness of memory. Oh no, because these things were recorded contemporaneously. But of course, that's not true, right? Jonathan is not actually recording these events as they happen. We see this from the sawtooth, jagged structure of these first 4 chapters that we discussed last week. He will go off and have an adventure. He will go off and have an experience, and then come back and write it down. And even in that short period of time, there's enough space for the memory to become muddled. And certainly the cumulative effect of being in Castle Dracula for all these many months seems significant. It seems as though it is actually wearing him out, that something is brooding and growing within him in terms of his apprehension of this castle. Although we might, again, look at that first excerpt there from chapter 2 and speculate that he is simply more attuned to the place than he is recognizing at that time. This is significant because we're going to be talking about, well, what? About premonitions, about prophecies, about senses of the future, glimpses of the future. We'll have the opportunity to talk about that in the company of Mina in the near future. So this carries us all the way through to June 25th. Oh, and I guess I should footnote too, we'll be talking about Renfield as well in the context of that, not just Mina's friend on the clifftop there in Whitby. We'll get to all of that. Let's leave behind Transylvania for now then, and get to Mina, our thoroughly modern Mina. Quote, forgive my long delay in writing, but I've been simply overwhelmed with work. The life of an assistant schoolmistress is sometimes trying. I am longing to be with you, and by the sea, where we can talk together freely and build our castles in the air. I have been working very hard lately because I want to keep up with Jonathan's studies, and I have been practicing shorthand very assiduously. When we are married, I shall be able to be useful to Jonathan, and if I can stenograph well enough, I can take down what he wants me to say in this way and write it out for him on the typewriter, at which I am also practicing very hard. He and I sometimes write letters in shorthand, and he is keeping a stenographic journal of his travels abroad. When I am with you, I shall keep a diary in the same way. I don't mean one of those 2 pages to the week with Sunday squeezed in a corner diaries, but a sort of journal, which I can write in whenever I feel inclined. I do not suppose it will be much of interest to other people, but it is not intended for them. I may show it to Jonathan someday if there's anything worth sharing, but it is really an exercise book. I shall try to do what I see lady journalists do, interviewing and writing descriptions and trying to remember conversations. I am told that with a little practice, one can remember all that goes on or that one hears said during a day. This, of course, is a skill which will be enormously helpful to Mina through the course of this book because of that epistolary format. So, a couple of things here to point out immediately before we even get into the characterization here. She is writing to Lucy, who we shall meet in a moment, and this letter is dated May the 9th. That is the day after Dracula shatters Harker's shaving mirror. He defenestrates Harker's shaving mirror there. So we are already leaning into this idea of dramatic irony. The audience, the readership, is in possession of information that the characters do not themselves possess. And we can open the door, I suppose, to the room of inquiry and speculate about what Stoker is trying to do here. But through these chapters, the next 2 chapters, we are certainly going to leverage this idea that there is a ticking clock, that time is racing ever onward, and that events have been building in multiple places, in multiple directions, multiple vectors, right, for a certain amount of time. That something is coming and that thing will arrive when it means to arrive. So here we are back in May 9th. Let's talk a little about Mina's character then, because I find Mina to be just delightful, right? I find Mina and Lucy to be delightful. I think that these characters often divide the audience. I think that you are either a Mina Murray person or a Lucy Westenra person. I love both of them, and I see them very much as pinning the furthest ends of a spectrum of acceptable Victorian femininity, right? They are very different, but they both operate within this socially sanctioned safe space for women. We can see that very clearly here in just the second line, right? Forgive my long delay in writing, but I've been simply overwhelmed with work. What's that you say? Monocle popping out, mustache bristling. She's a working woman. The life of an assistant schoolmistress is sometimes trying, oh, she's a working woman. But she's working in one of the fields where women are absolutely permitted to work, where it is socially acceptable for women to work. She's a modern woman, right? She's learning shorthand. She's using a typewriter, a device which has only existed really for like 20 years at the point at which this book is written. So she is modern and progressive and technologically skillful, but she is putting these things to the service of her husband and his career. She wants to learn shorthand. She wants to learn to type so that she can better record the things that he has to say and be of use to him. Running through this too, of course, there is a motif, I suppose, a thematic idea that we will return to again and again. It's going to be called out very specifically by Dr. Seward much later in today's reading, but here we can already see it, right? The virtue of work, this Victorian idea that working, that doing your job, that being professional, that exercising your skills, these are ways of keeping the emotions at bay, right? This is the exercise of one's rationality and excellence as a counterpoint to one's fear. We're going to see Mina do exactly this as she's worrying about Jonathan later, much later when she's in Whitby, and we will see Dr. Seward explicitly do this after he has been rejected by Lucy. His proposal has been turned down. So I love all of this. And I love the characterization of it too, right? We can see the admiration of the lady journalists. She's learning the skills of the lady journalists, but she has no desire to be such a scandalous thing as a lady journalist herself, you understand. There's no sense that she's pushing against the envelope of permissible Victorian behavior for ladies. And there is, too, I think, a little playfulness here. We shall see, I shall tell you of my little plans, the 2 pages to the week with Sunday squeezed in a corner. There is some characterization here. She is being deliberately, I think, witty, deliberately wry. She is enjoying herself, which tells us that this is not a pose, that Mina's Mina-ness isn't something that she's affecting, and certainly not something she's affecting for the benefit of Lucy, right? The warmth of these letters, I think, shines through absolutely. But it is something that is sincere. She really is just a good Victorian woman. And that's important because we're going to oppose her. We're going to juxtapose her with the equally fabulous, though very different, Lucy Westenra here. This is taken from Lucy's first letter in response. And I do think that the power of these two letters in such close proximity is really effective. I think that we really get a vivid sense of these two characters, both individually and in combination. This is Lucy's letter. Quote, "My dearest Mina, I must say you tax me very unfairly with being a bad correspondent. I wrote you twice since we parted, and your last letter was only your second. Besides, I have nothing to tell you. There is really nothing to interest you. Town is very pleasant just now, and we go to a great deal of picture galleries and for walks and rides in the park. As to the tall, curly-haired man, I suppose it was the one who was with me at the last pop. Someone has evidently been telling tales. That was Mr. Holmwood. He often comes to see us, and he and Mamma get on very well together. They have so many things to talk about in common. We met some time ago a man who would just do for you if you were not already engaged to Jonathan. He is an excellent parti, being handsome, well off, and of good birth. He is a doctor, and really clever. Just fancy, he is only 29, and he has an immense lunatic asylum, all under his own care. Sign me up. Where can you find yourself in this day and age? A man of 29 with a whole lunatic asylum under his own care. That's the next season of The Bachelor. Just has to be this guy, right? So we can see here that Lucy is very different from Mina in basically every way, right? Her focus is completely different. She's talking about not professionalism and modernity and work. She's talking about society. She is talking about walks in the park and visits to picture galleries and attending the pops, right? The pops were a kind of general term used for concerts of popular music, not your stuffy classical music, but also not your, rowdy Victorian music hall experience. This is something that sits between the two. The Victorian era is the point at which technology has reached such sophistication and duplication is possible with such relative ease that pop culture becomes a thing, right? The popular culture is a term coined in the Victorian era because for the first time, the idea of a mass market unified culture is a thing which can exist and does exist. And the pops are an example of that. It's not quite a Taylor Swift concert, right? But it is your local Philharmonic playing an evening at the movies, right? Where they'll play some John Williams and they'll play some, other themes from, they'll play the theme from the Avengers, of course they will. And they'll also play some slightly more erudite stuff. They'll play the theme from Schindler's List, but it'll be something that's accessible, something that's slightly higher minded than the most popular entertainment, but is still something that can be readily communicated to the mass audience. So that's the pops. The other word that I should call out here, of course, is parti, just simply an eligible bachelor, just a young, handsome, provisioned young man who is in the market for a wife. And of course, Lucy knows that Dr. Seward, the man to whom she is referring, is in want of a wife because he will propose to her in the very near future. What we really get, though, from Lucy here, well, we get exclamation points, right? We get exclamation points and we get italics. We get enthusiasm. We get playfulness. It is still gentle. It is still affectionate. It is still loving. It is barbed, but there's no real sense of any hostility, right? She's just enjoying needling her friend because her friend is very close to her, because they have this companionable acquaintance. And her own exercise of her intelligence, I suppose, is social rather than Mina's, which is rational, which is more modern, which is more professional. Lucy's excellence here is absolutely social. She can play with the little flirting game and the little needling game and the little teasing game and all of these things. She can set that conversation alight more readily even than Mina, because this is her area of excellence. And in that way, I think, as I say, I think these two women kind of define what is an acceptable social space for Victorian women, right? Mina is as modern as you can be and still be good, and Lucy is as flighty as you can be and still be good. These two women are both exceptional. They are both compatible with our broader sense of society, albeit in very different ways. We're then going to move into Lucy's next letter. I guess, yes, this is the description of... We're going to move into the next letter and her three proposals. And I'll footnote here just a little that three is already such an interesting number, right? Three is a very significant number in folklore anyway. In mythology, threes are very common. Three is the basic necessary narrative unit, right? Three beats define a story. A single beat is just an event. Two beats form a chain, right? Two beats can be placed next to each other and we can infer, but in that inference, we are inferring the third beat, right? You establish, you reinforce, you subvert. You have your beginning, your middle, your end. You have your first, second, third act. All of narrative basically breaks down into collections of three beats, clusters of three beats inside a scene, three scenes inside a chapter, three chapters inside an act, right? That is like the most elemental, the most straightforward and reliable and mechanical kind of narrative structure that you can get to. So threes, for that reason, right? Because we intuit stories. We internalize narrative structure. You know, we internalize here in the Anglophonic community. We internalize that like Western European narrative structure from birth, from the beginning, right? Three Little Pigs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. There are threes everywhere because we understand that three is the most functional narrative structure. And of course, we expand that out into stories that we don't realize are stories. We expand that out into, the three spirits visiting Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. That is, of course, a story that didn't come from mythology. But you understand what I'm saying. Into myth, into folklore, into fairy tale, right? Fairies knock three times or things like that. The three is very important. And we've seen some threes already. We've seen the three vampire brides, like most notably. They're the ones that have shown up most visibly, the fair-haired vampire bride and the two dark-haired, aquiline-nosed vampire brides. We also, crucially, have Dracula formally inviting Harker into his home 3 times. He specifically says, I invite you in 3 times. And these things are, important, significant, yes, as we start to build a lexicon of understanding, as we start to alight upon significant moments as we're moving forward. And certainly the 3 men that orbit Lucy, well, they kind of do the same thing, perhaps in combination with Jonathan Harker, but they kind of do the same thing that Mina and Lucy themselves do. Let's get into this slide here as we see the aftermath of Quincy's proposal, of the second man here, right? Quote, this is from Lucy's letter to Mina. We'll get into some attributed dialogue in just a moment. My dear Mina, why are men so noble when we women are so little worthy of them? Here was I, almost making fun of this great-hearted, true gentleman. I burst into tears. I am afraid, my dear, you will think this a very sloppy letter in more ways than one, and I really felt very badly. Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble? But this is heresy, and I must not say it. I'm glad to say that, though I was crying, I was able to look into Mr. Morris's brave eyes, and I told him out straight, yes, there is someone I love, though he may not have told me yet that he even loves me. I was right to speak to him so frankly, for quite a light came into his face, and he put out both his hands and took mine. I think I put them into his, and said in a hearty way, that's my brave girl. It's better worth being late for a chance of winning you than being in time for any other girl in the world. I mean, if you can't get yourself a guy who has his own lunatic asylum, you might settle for a Gothic Victorian cowboy, right? These 3 men that are introduced here, Arthur Holmwood, of course, is the one who will end up marrying, he is the one whose proposal will be accepted, for sure. Dr. Seward, who we'll get to in just a moment, and Quincy Morris. These 3 men are each archetypal. They are each as emblematic of Victorian masculinity as Mina and Lucy are emblematic of Victorian femininity. Again, acceptable Victorian masculinity, acceptable Victorian femininity. We have in Dr. Seward the intellectual, the academic, the doctor, right? He is the master of his rational impulse. Harker kind of co-opts that space too, but Harker is much more, he is of the professional classes rather than of the intellectual classes. He doesn't belong to the academy. He belongs to a actual professional structure, right, as detailed in the book owned by Dracula, of course. Then we have Arthur, who is, as we'll learn from Mina in just a moment, he is a young aristocrat, right? He is a nobleman. He embodies that lineage and that, slightly higher-minded and more naturally authoritative branch of Victorian life, right? We've talked before about how the rise of the professional classes in the Victorian era kind of challenges and destabilizes what we think of as the aristocratic regime which preceded it. And that is true, but that is not to suggest that these aristocrats all just vanish overnight, right? There's still in the Victorian psyche an element of, particularly, of course, under the rule of Queen Victoria, there's still an element of I don't know, a certain God-granted nobility to the aristocracy, even as their practical quotidian control of the world is being destabilized by the rise of the professional classes, and to a certain degree to the rise of the academic classes too, right? And then we have our fourth man. We have Quincy P. Morris, who here is so gentle in his acceptance of Lucy's rejection of his proposal. He is two things. He is an adventurer and he is American. And those things are romantic, right? He shows up like Indiana Jones. And there's an element to that in Stoker's writing. I talked a little before about how Stoker was ever the popularist, right? His other novels are just much more straightforward. They're much more kind of pulpy, right? He kind of anticipates the post-Victorian rise of pulp, while absolutely reflecting the Victorian pulp aesthetic itself, which is subtly different, right? He's kind of moving into a more worldly 20th century modality there, I think, but there's a lot to be taken. I don't want to present. I'm hesitant to even be declamatory in this, because I don't want to present, as the rest of his work is so often presented, I don't want to present the rest of Stoker's work as being either just flatly inferior to Dracula or of all being the same kind of thing, right? It is differently inflected, but there are differences within that body of work too. And I will say, I'm stating this from a position of relative ignorance, because I've read some of it. Most of the other work that I have read has been in the pursuit of this podcast, right? When I was laid out for a month with COVID, I was reading some more Stoker and some more writing about Stoker's work. But it is varied, but it is also pulpier, and that pulpiness, that two-fisted modernity, takes us to America quite naturally. In fact, it takes us to the figure of Quincy P. Morris. It takes us to the figure of this Texas cattleman, right? Who is so effusive in his language, is so crisp and clear and uncluttered by Victorian conventionality. He is uncluttered by English courtesy. He manages to speak much more plainly, though not meaningfully in a less flowery way, right? He chooses his words just as carefully, or expresses himself with the same range of poetic fluency as the other characters do. More so, in fact, as we see later in his, I don't remember if I pulled it as a slide now. Maybe we'll get to his invitation to Arthur to come drinking to drown their sorrows in the aftermath of Lucy's proposals. Not Arthur's sorrows, of course. Arthur's probably feeling quite good about it. But Quincy writes this enormously elaborate and convivial, right? Really charming kind of boyish letter to Arthur, inviting him to come out drinking with him and Seward. And Arthur replies in a telegram, which is just very clipped and terse and English. So again, just tons of characterization all the way through here. The point to take, though, I really want to emphasize, is this idea that these four men are not accidental men, right? These four men are not just random characters. It is quite clear, I think, that Stoker is developing a schematic of Victorianness that we will then see clash with something that is not Victorian, right? He is building a schematic of the modern world, in fact, right? Not just Englishness, because that's the inclusion of Quincy. That's the inclusion, ultimately, of Van Helsing, who we'll get to in due course. He is building a schematic of the modern world that is about to be hit by the ancient world, the older world. And that seems to be the intention here in terms of our suddenly expanded central cast, right? We go from having one POV character and one supporting character, right, antagonistically Dracula there, to suddenly having 6 characters that we're keeping track of, a couple more who we're engaged with, who we're being reported upon. We're still worrying about Jonathan through Mina. We're still getting all of this richness and depth and complexity, but it just blows out to encompass the entire rational modern world. We'll get to that as we move forward too. Oh, I guess the other 3 that I wanted to mention was, of course, the 3 sheets of paper with the 3 envelopes and the 3 letters that Dracula had Harker write. And there we do something really interesting, because that, of course, is a unit of 3 that is used to create exactly the kind of narrative that I was describing, right? It is, I am sending a letter to say that I am leaving, I'm sending a letter to say that I am happily on the road, and I'm sending a letter to say that I've almost arrived, right? We're building out a 3-act structure there in these 3 letters. So it's 3s upon 3s upon 3s there. Let's move on to our next slide here with the introduction of one Dr. Seward and his account of his most notorious patient. R.M. Renfield, ETAT 59, sanguine temperament, great physical strength, morbidly excitable, periods of gloom ending in some fixed idea which I cannot make out. I presume that the sanguine temperament itself and the disturbing influence end in a mentally accomplished finish. A possibly dangerous man, probably dangerous if unselfish. In selfish man, caution is as secure an armor for their foes as for themselves. What I think of on this point is when self is the fixed point, the centripetal force is balanced with the centrifugal. When duty, a cause, etc., is the fixed point, the latter force is paramount, and only accident or a series of accidents can balance it. End quote. Wow, what a passage! What a knockout bit of writing! This is so interesting. It's also really fascinating, I think, to chart the shift in language here, because we're introducing an entirely new typographical type, an entirely new documentary type, forgive me, into the proceedings here, because previously we've had Jonathan's journal, of course, which is very carefully composed and is kind of conscious of its own composition, right? Then we get some letters, which are themselves partially conscious of their own composition, as when Lucy is relating the story of her proposals, for example, but are also kind of more immediate and unauthored in that sense, right? You're not creating a thing that will endure, you're creating a thing with an immediate purpose. Here we have a transcription of Dr. Seward's phonograph. He is speaking aloud, and this is the transcription of that recording, which, again, modernity. Victorian era technology, right? This is sophistication. This is technical sophistication at a very high level. This tells us a lot. And we can see how that translates into this staccato rhythm that falls away as he warms to his subject, right? This etat 15, etat there just Latin for like approximate age. Sanguine temperament, great physical strength, morbidly excitable, periods of gloom, ending in some fixed idea which I cannot make out, right? This just relation of facts and information here. And then he warms to his subject. The fact that Renfield is selfish protects not only him, but the world, because there is a mediation between the centripetal and the centrifugal force, right? The inward force and the outward force. They are imbalanced because Renfield is ultimately self-regarding. If one is not ultimately self-regarding, if one is more heroic, if one is focused on duty, then one will pour oneself out in the pursuit of that, and there will be nothing to balance your desire for action. You will be spent, and there will be no natural limit in the action that you will take in the world. You will dedicate yourself to the accomplishing of your goal, whereas Renfield, ultimately selfish, ultimately self-regarding, is limited in the actions that he will take in the world, because he will also preserve himself. He will also protect himself. His evil would be that much greater if he were not so self-regarding, right? Which I think is a really interesting and subtle philosophical point for Stoker to bring in here, and is going to be fascinating as we move forward. We're going to really spend the last third of this novel kind of taking swings at heroism as an idea, right? Different perspectives and different modes of interaction with the idea of what it is to be heroic. And some of that is being seeded right here. So, as I say, Dr. Seward here, John Seward, sometimes referred to as Jack, a common nickname for Johns in the period. He is our professional mind. He is our academic mind, I should say, rather. He is an intellectual. He is an expert on this character of Renfield, who we'll spend some more time discussing as we move forward. We then conclude the short chapter with the exchange of letters between Quincy and Arthur that I mentioned earlier. This really charming, ebullient, crafted like declaration of formal friendship between Quincy and Arthur, and the very clipped telegram in response. Another type of document that is being entered into this epistolary novel format, right? Another kind of found footage that's being folded into the narrative here. And we're really approaching at this point, with the introduction of the phonographic transcript and the introduction of the telegram, as well as the letters, of course, we're moving away from a journalistic endeavor. You know, the overlap of pun there, I think, is appropriate. We're moving away from the reportage of the journal form into something that is, well, which 100 years after Stoker would have been referred to as multimedia storytelling, right? You can imagine like a version of Dracula created in the 1990s that came on a CD-ROM, where you would read a letter and then you'd have a scan of a journal page, and then you'd maybe hear like the audio clip of the phonograph, right? You'd see the actual printed document of the telegram response. That's the 90s for you, and God, I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss it. Look at that. We've covered an entire chapter. We are now ready to move on. Chapter 5 spans May 9th to May 26th, right? So we are deep in Harker's personal history. We're already a month in advance of that by the time that we end Harker's account of his time in Transylvania. So we reset and we still stay in May, but then we cut ahead. We begin with Mina in Whitby, dated July 24th, and I'll just do a little bit of framing out here to show you where Whitby is. This is Whitby on the coast of North Yorkshire in the northeastern part of England. It's on the North Sea coast, right? I grew up on the North Sea coast, 500 miles north of this, and it is cold and it is unyielding and it is fierce. It is also, of course, historically a vulnerable place to live, right? We get this description that Mina gives of Whitby Abbey being ransacked by the Danes in 867, right? The Vikings come in their longships, the Danes and the Norse come in their longships, and they just ravage this coast, and they did for like 200 years, right? It was a very real thing that happened. Interestingly, Whitby Abbey, which I've got right here, in fact, if I can show you a picture, yeah, this is this is Whitby Abbey, which Mina describes as being ransacked by the Danes. It was, that is true, that happened in the 9th century, and it was all but destroyed. The edifice which exists today, which you can see here, is actually constructed in the 13th, 14th, and even a little bit into the 15th centuries. It's much later than the Danish assaults on the North Yorkshire coast. This is constructed to serve and to provide for Benedictine monks, who then abandon it in the 16th century after the Catholic suppressions of King Henry VIII, right? So it falls into disuse then. It is then basically turned into a private residence and abandoned entirely in the 17th century. So this kind of Gothic architecture that we see here, which Mina notes, kind of stands as a pillar of error. Mina doesn't note. Mina implies, right, that this abbey stands as a pillar of Gothic Englishness against the torment and the foul winds of the north, right? The danger, the blood, the violence that is coming from the sea to the shore here in North Yorkshire. That's not actually true, but it is kind of the story. It is still, I think, a powerful piece of self-identity in Whitby there. We should note that the reason that it is Whitby, besides the fact that Whitby is a very popular tourist destination, which will be folded into the story itself in the chapters to come, the reason that it's Whitby is that Stoker himself goes to Whitby in 1890. It is in Whitby, it is in the Whitby Public Library within a card catalogue that he finds the name Dracula and decides to use that for the villain of his book. Whitby was just a real tourist town during the Victorian era, and remains so today, absolutely. But Whitby was also, I should note this too, because we're not, I think, going to get a chance to talk about the Demeter this week, but we'll talk about it next week for sure, because it's a fascinating chapter of the book and really one of my favorite chapters, I think. But the Demeter is inspired by the wreck and the ruin of a Russian cargo ship called the Dmitri, which smashes into the rocks off Whitby, just north of the town, around 1890. So Stoker's really kind of folding in his experience of this town, and certainly he'll fold in his experience of the Yorkshire dialect here as we move on to our next slide and we introduce Mr. Swales. Now, this is going to be tricky because I don't have a Yorkshire. I don't really have a northeastern England accent at my disposal, and I'm not going to try because I think it would do it less service. And there is something too about not affecting an accent for this, I think, that will, A, I'm sure be a relief to you guys listening to the show after the fact, and B, will kind of preserve the archaic ungainliness of the language here, because this is dense. Mr. Swales sharing here his Yorkshire ire, right? Nice little duplication of that terminal syllable. His Yorkshire ire here is represented in this very idiosyncratic approach to language. Some of this is just made up, right? Some of it is just fabricated by Stoker and kind of leans into this idea of a dialect so obscure that it's opaque, right? That you really just can't get to what he's saying. Much of it is Northern English. Some of it specifically Yorkshire, some of it Lancashire, some of it, even into the southern reaches of Scotland there too. And some of it is just from other parts of England. Some of it's just been kind of cobbled together here in the body, the soul, the being of Mr. Swales. So I want to look at that as an exercise in writing, right? I want to look at Stoker's skill here communicating voice. I also want to recognize that this is Mina exercising her own excellence. What did she say? She admires lady journalists. She wants to be able to transcribe everything that is written down, or everything that she hears, through the course of the day. And here she does exactly that. She does it with, we can only speculate, beautiful precision, right? She manages to really master what it is that Swales is saying to her through this section. So we're doing both of that, but we can't forget to look at the substance here. We can't forget to do the necessary legwork to decipher what it is that Swales is saying and get to the nut of it, because this isn't just a little comic diversion. This is something much more important, and it's paired with an extremely important revelation about Swales in the chapters to come. Let's look then at this quote. It be all fool talk, lock, stock, and barrel. That's what it be, and nowt else. These bands and wafts and Boh-Ghosts and Barguests and Bogles and all and ant, them is only fit to set bairns and dizzy women a belderin'. There's nowt but air blabs. They and all grims and signs and warnings, they all invented by parsons and ilsome book bodies and railway touters and to skeer and scunner halflings, and to get them to do something that they don't other incline to. It makes me ireful to think of them. Why, it's them that, not content with printing lies on paper and preaching them out of pulpits, does want to be cutting them on tombstones. Here, look here all around you look here all around you in what art you will. All them stains, holding up their heads as well as they can out of their pride as a cat, simply tumbling down with the weight of the lies wrote on them. Here lies the body, or sacred to the memory, wrote in all of them, and yet nigh half of them here bain't no bodies at all, and the memories of them bain't be care to pinch and snuff about, much less sacred. Wow, forgive me for stumbling through the middle of that, but I'm sure you understand the challenge that was ahead of me there. So, what is his point? What is his ire, right? What is the source of his ire here? The lies that are told. Certainly the lies that are inscribed on the tombstones, yes, right? As he goes into later, many of these recount deaths in distant places, losses of young sailors at sea. These graves are empty. These tombstones mark nothing but memory. Now, he's taking that to be a lie, right? It's the specificity of here lies so-and-so, a person who was lost in the North Sea, when of course that person does not in fact lie here at all. He's also taking to task the idea of right, sacred memory, right? That actually many of these people weren't particularly loved or well regarded during their lifetimes either. These things are just lies. The weight of these lies, that have been carved onto these tombstones is pulling the tombstones down themselves, kind of pulling them back to the earth where they may be, overwhelmed by nature itself. They'll be taken back into the core of the earth. Let's look at the beginning here. All fool talk, right? Lock, stock, and barrel. That's pretty accessible. All of this is just, it's garbage, it's lies, it's nonsense. That's all it be and naught else. These bands and wafts and Boh-Ghosts and Barguests and Bogles. So we got a lot going on here, right? Bands and wafts, just airy spirits, right? Ghosts, you might think of. Boh-Ghosts, though, not ghosts. Boh-Ghosts would be more like a goblin figure or like a gremlin figure. Barguests is like hobgoblins, right? So kind of leaning into that same idea. And Bogles, bogies, right? Just creatures that cause noises in the night. All of these are only fit to set bairns and dizzy women a belderin. They're only there to upset children and silly women. That's the only reason that we tell these ghost stories, these supernatural stories, these tales of monsters and goblins and darkness, right? The only reason we do it is just to upset children and women. They're naught but air blabs. They're nothing but bubbles. They're nothing but just thoughts that will pop into the world, and that's it. They and all grims and signs and warnings, right? So we've got, here are these stories that we tell, and they're only fit for upsetting children and women. But we go further. Why then do we tell these stories? Why then do we tell these tales? They and all grims and signs and warnings, right? Like omens and tales to fear. All of these things are created by three different categories of people: parsons, ilsome book bodies, and railway touters. Parsons, obviously we can lean into here a certain religious skepticism from Mr. Swales at this point. These stories are created by people standing behind pulpits, right? Book bodies is hard to parse. It's not completely clear what he means. I take it to mean like learned people. I take it to mean, intellectuals who are, speculating, historians perhaps, or those who are interested in mythology and folklore. I mean, yeah, the meaning on that one is not completely clear, but that's certainly, book here being the you can hear it in my voice, I'm sure, that North Yorkshire corruption of book, right? It's just this ilsome book bodies, this being, yeah, just like wrong-headed or somehow unwell, literary types. And then, of course, railway touters. This is the tourist industry. These are people who tell these stories in order to encourage tourists to come to Whitby. And what is the ultimate aim of these three categories of people for telling all of these fool stories, right? All of this fool talk is to make people, to skeer and scunner halflings and to get folks to do something that they don't other incline to. It is a means of manipulation. It is a means of coercion. We tell these stories, these people tell these stories in order to compel other folk to do what they want them to do, whether that be to attend church and tithe and worship God, or to buy books and to go to lecture tours, right? Like the Dickens lecture tour that would have happened in fairly recent memory at this point, or to get on a train and go to Whitby in North Yorkshire and spend your time and your money as a part of their tourist industry, right? These are coercive means. So all of this is true, right? All of this to some extent, I mean, Mr. Swales is justified in his belief of these things to a certain extent. He's lacking a certain narrative imagination. He's lacking a certain romance, perhaps, right? He's failing to see the power of stories to inform and to educate and to entertain, to illuminate, even though we all know that they are not literally true. It's still fun to read a scary book, we say, while reading a scary book, right? The fact that he's delivering this through Mina, he's delivering this lecture directly at the reader, who is falling prey to exactly the kind of manipulation that Mr. Swales is railing against here, but also there are some other things happening here. We're talking about empty graves. We're talking about empty tombstones. We're talking about things being honored and sacred when they are not, in fact, honored and sacred. We're drawing a distinction between the representation of a kind of honest faithfulness, right? An honest respect to the body of the dead, and the simulacra of that, the facsimile of that, something that is cheaper and something that is gaudier, something that is itself insubstantial, something that is corruptive more than that, right? It is not just that these things are hollow and that they don't mean what they claim to mean. It's that they bear a weight that will tear down the stones upon which they are written, right? There's something bigger and heavier working here. And all of that, I think, is true. All of that, I think, is important. We are going to come back, though, to Mr. Swales in the near future. In fact, I think I've got one more slide, and then we're going to come back to him, because there's a temptation when we're reading Stoker, when we're reading Victorian literature in general, by the way, which is a weird bias that I haven't really been able to unpick. It came up during our discussion of Dickens' Great Expectations fairly recently. There's a weird presumption of a kind of emotional stability, a kind of emotional constancy in our fictional characters, right? That if in the Victorian mode a character is going to have a change of heart, you had best believe that change of heart will be accompanied by 2 full pages of exposition. That character will delve into their own emotional state and will declaim their new emotional state, and then we'll move forward, right? It will be this threshold that has been crossed. And it is my belief, though this is not a commonly held view, it's my belief that Stoker is playing with this very consistently through the entire book. We've already talked about Harker in Transylvania and how he changes. That is not, I think, a common part of the critical response to Dracula as a book. I think that most readers, most critics, most academics will look at that, most scholars will look at that and see a very constant character. I see a character who is transformed in those, or not completely transformed, but who begins to change in those first 4 chapters, right? We're kind of moving away from this revelatory transformation, right? The idea that change happens suddenly in a climactic, titanic instant. I think Mr. Swales gives us another perspective on that. We'll get to that in just a moment. I do, though, need to cut back to Seward and his study of Renfield from Mina's entry. This is Mina's entry on August 1st. That's when she talks first with Swales. We cut back to Seward and his study of Renfield all the way back at the beginning of June. So we're continuing to play games with the timeline here, right? We're cutting back an entire month to an event which happened basically in the chronology of the previous chapter, right? It could have been appended to the end of the previous chapter without disturbing our understanding of the timeline at all. Stoker is still playing games and rewarding, I think, the careful reader. We are being rewarded for paying attention to the epistolary nature of the novel itself. If we're paying attention to the documents, when was this written? Where did it come from? What was its intent? What was its intended audience? What was the form that it took? The more attention we pay to that stuff, the more we get from this novel as a collection of documents, right? And we get, the thing that is great about that, the reason that I like found footage movies and other people don't so much, is that there's a necessary interactivity between those 2 forms. You have to be able to parse and invest and intuit, infer from the text the things that are happening around it and how those things connect together. So let's take a look at this passage here as we jump, as I say, back to the beginning of June, at which point we catalog Renfield's obsession, Renfield's compulsion, Renfield's mania, Renfield's pursuit, his preoccupation, just his occupation, in fact. He is collecting flies using parts of his own food, right? Parts of his own sugar supply and things like that, right? There we see, by the way, an example of what Seward is talking about earlier, right? If Renfield were not so selfish, he might use all of his food to capture the flies that he wants to capture. Instead, he is using some of his food to capture the flies and keeping some of it for himself, thereby maintaining himself in the present as well as, somewhat dubiously, in the future. So he catches the flies, which he feeds to the spiders, which he feeds to the sparrows, which he would love to feed to a cat, but instead feasts upon himself in order to achieve some greater goal. This is the passage that I've pulled here. Quote, "How well the man reasoned. Lunatics always do within their own scope. I wonder at how many lives he values a man, or if at only one. He has closed the account most accurately, and today begun a new record. How many of us begin a new record with each day of our lives? To me, it seems only yesterday that my whole life ended with my new hope, and that truly I began a new record. So it shall be, until the great recorder sums me up and closes my ledger account with a balance to profit or loss. Oh, Lucy, Lucy, I cannot be angry with you, nor can I be angry with my friend whose happiness is yours, but I must only wait on hopeless and work. If I could have as strong a cause as my poor mad friend there, a good, unselfish cause to make me work, that would indeed be happiness." End quote. So, a couple of things here. Let's note that good, unselfish cause, right there at the end. If I could have a good, unselfish cause that I could work toward, well, that would be happiness. No, Dr. Seward, you're forgetting. If you have a good, unselfish cause that you can dedicate yourself to, it obliterates the self. You cause harm to yourself. There's no balance there. There's no goodness there. You need a certain amount of self-regard in order to continue in the world, as we ourselves, over the course of the last week, have had proven to us once again. So here he's comparing the end of Renfield's great experiment, right? He feasts on these sparrows and then, as we're told, disgorges raw flesh and feathers in great quantity, because that's a terrible idea. And then, crucially, just starts over. He just starts building this pyramid, right? He starts building this food chain again from the jump. He goes back to flies and starts building up again. And Seward sees this as being kind of admirable, I guess, right? Because it is at least logical. How well the man reasoned. Lunatics always do within their own scope. The thing about a lunatic is that a lunatic isn't just like crazy. A lunatic doesn't behave randomly. A lunatic believes something that is incorrect to be true, and then acts in accordance with that belief, right? And how much are we seeing that echoed through the rest of the book? How many times are we seeing people who believe something that is not true, or do not believe something that is true, and act with what is them complete rationality, or what is to them complete rationality, but which is ultimately, to us who possess a little more information, to the reader who possesses a little more information, is ultimately a flawed understanding of the world. They are acting foolishly, right? They are acting like lunatics. And again, I'll asterisk all of this and just excuse all of the language around mental health here. It's terrible and reductive, and from a modern perspective, just objectionable. But the intent here that Stoker is giving us is not to deride or to demean Renfield. It is actually to explore something that is interesting about him. The fact that his belief has led him astray in this one regard, well, it still gives him a kind of purpose, a kind of accomplishment, right? Which Seward is now searching out. Having been denied by Lucy and having seen Lucy become happily affianced to Arthur Holmwood, here instead, he seeks refuge in exactly the kind of virtue that we were talking about earlier with Mina, right? Work. Work is the thing. Rationality is the thing. But even in that desire, he's kind of wandering away from the point. If only I had some great duty, if only I had some great cause, I could lose myself and not feel this anymore. Which, yeah, I mean, we've all kind of had that instinct, I think, again, over the course of the last week. So here and I love to, I'll just note here too, how much I adore the perspectives on Lucy that we get from other writers. It's extremely strong here. I am running very long. Let's hit one more slide here, because I really do want to get back to Mr. Swells. I want to get back to Mr. Swells, and I want to focus on the change of heart that occurs here. This is August 6th. This is almost a week later, right? This is almost a week after her first encounter, or the accounted encounter with Mr. Swells. What we see through this part too is Mina feeling exactly the same thing as Dr. Seward, right? She is beginning to worry more and more for Harker, who has now been absent for far too long, right? She's had no word. She's worried. She's afraid. She is trying to distract herself with work, with the great panacea of work. If you are feeling uncertain, if you are feeling afraid, if you are feeling heartbreak, if you are feeling grief, just go to work. That's the Victorian mindset. That's the admirable Victorian mindset, right? Industry is the thing. Industry is the thing which will save us. Again, I don't want to present that as mental health advice here in the year 2024, but I would also be somewhat disingenuous if I said that I haven't fallen into that trap myself more than once. So let's take a look at our return to Mr. Swells and this change of heart that he has here. Quote, "Someday soon the angel of death will sound his trumpet for me, but don't you duel and greet, my dearie, for he saw that I was crying. If he should come this very night, I'd not refuse to answer his call. For life be, after all, only a waiting for something else than what we're doing, and death be all that we can rightly depend on. But I'm content, for it's coming to me, my dearie, and coming quick. It may be coming while we be looking and wondering. Maybe it's in that wind out over the sea that's bringing with it loss and wreck and sore distress and sad hearts. Look, look, he cried suddenly. There's something in the wind and in the host beyond it that sounds and looks and tastes and smells like death. It's in the air. I feel it coming. Lord, make me answer cheerful when my call comes." End quote. So very simply, right, very transparently, this is the payoff to all of the work we did establishing Mr. Swells' character earlier, right? We gave him all of that dialect. We gave him all of that affectation. We gave him all of that like idiosyncratic approach to the world, all of that individualism, all of that singularism. And this is where that pays out, because what we have here is something that is so powerful and moving and honest and unaffected in exactly the same way as what came before was honest, yes, but to some degree affected. So we've had here a profound change of heart. What is the nature of that change of heart? As he's standing on the hillside in the graveyard, kind of protesting the idea that these tombstones are covered in carved lies, that these graves are empty, that these people weren't cared about, that they weren't sacred in memory at all, here he is transformed. Death is something that is the only reliable thing. It will come to you. And maybe that's the fundamental repositioning that's occurred, right? He has gone from thinking about the death of others to the death of himself, but he was 100 years old even when we met him, a week ago. Mina emphasizes that by saying that he fought at Waterloo, right? So he's already an extremely old man. Is it possible to think that he hadn't considered death? Is it possible to think that he hadn't lost friends and family in the course of that long, long life? If he hadn't lost comrades on the field, right? Of course he had. Of course he had. He's considered death and he understands its place in life. But now something has altered. Now he is feeling something immediate. He is feeling something that is coming for him, right? And again, we see perhaps an instance of the kind of intuition that we discussed right at the beginning of today's episode with Jonathan in Transylvania. Because he starts talking about, right, I'm content, for it's coming to me, my dearie, and coming quick, right? That's just a philosophical statement. Hey, you know what? Actually, it's preceded by the philosophical statement. Death comes for us all. Death is the only thing that we can depend on. And I'm content because it's coming. And it's coming quick. And it's almost here. And it might be coming on the wind that's blowing right now in off the sea, that's bringing wreck and sorrow. It might be right out there. And then he senses it out there. He's literally right. This is the wind that is blowing the Demeter to the shores of Whitby, to the North Yorkshire coast, right? There is death and blood and destruction coming, and it is coming on that wind. And he's apprehending that somehow with his physical senses too, right? This isn't just a prophecy. This isn't like a story. This isn't something that's being whispered to him from somewhere else. He's not having some like secondhand insight here. He's sensing it physically in this moment. There's something in that wind and in the host beyond it that sounds and looks and tastes and smells like death. It's in the air. I feel it coming. This is a physical experience that he's having, but it's preceded by just a general pull, right? It's preceded by a moment of intuition. Yeah, death is coming for me. Death is coming soon for me. Death might be coming while we're looking at it. Death might be coming on the wind that we're looking at. Death is definitely coming on the wind that we are looking at right now. I can feel it with my entire being. That's a progression that isn't, I think, terribly different from the kind of thing that we saw Harker do, as we discussed at the beginning of today's session. So what I want to, and of course, we can also, informed readers that we are, right? We can also kind of compare this to Renfield as well, right? The influence that Renfield is feeling. Something is happening here. Something is cutting through all of this Victorian modernism, all of this Victorian rationality, all of our intellect, all of our justified true beliefs, right? Our reliance on this like epistemological constant around us, and is like getting us in our older places. It is getting us like in our lizard brains, right? It's undercutting modernity and hitting us in an older space. And I find that completely fascinating, right? Whether or not Mr. Swales here has been changed, whether or not Mr. Swales here has been, whether or not he has, I guess, suffered a sincere change of heart, right? A complete and total sincere change of heart. He assures Mina that he didn't mean what he was saying before, right? He doesn't want Mina to be upset. He's also reassuring her here as she is crying at the intensity of this old man's revelations, right? He reassures her that he didn't mean it before. But is that true? Because that's a really impassioned speech to give to a young woman on a hillside if you don't mean it. It seems disingenuous to suggest that he doesn't mean it. I think it is perhaps closer to believe that he did mean it, and now he doesn't. Now that the reality of his death, right, not in the abstract, but in the immediate future, right, he knows that death is coming even before he says that he knows that death is coming. He's thinking about it, right? That's the first tickle of his intuition. That's the first tickle of his realization. He can sense this thing is coming, and it makes him realize, no, now is my time. And that's okay, because death is a constant, and you know, death comes for me the way that it's coming for everyone. Well, maybe not for me the way it's coming for everyone. Maybe it's coming on the wings of this black storm. Oh God, yes, it definitely is. I can feel it, right? That progression, I think, is just absolutely masterful. And that's where we're going to call it quits for this week, you guys. I'm a little over time, and we've covered everything I think that I really needed to cover so that we can get to the Demeter with great purpose next week. And as I say, well, we're going to spend some time on the Demeter, so we're not going to make huge progress. I would really like to make it to the end of chapter 12 by the end of next week's show, and Van Helsing's very powerful line of dialogue that he gets at the end of chapter 12. That's something to really look forward to. But I do really want to spend some time on the Demeter too. So we'll see how that works out. But we will, I promise, be picking up the pace from here going forward, assuming, of course, that there aren't any other catastrophes and curses which befall me here in this humble podcast studio. The end of the podcast, you guys, comes for us all. Before we wrap up, a little bit of quick housekeeping. I have decided to do 2 bonus episodes for our Dracula unit over on the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/nextword, where you can help me and support this podcast endeavor and congratulate me, reward me, I suppose, financially for not making you listen to terrible ads. Guys, I have listened to podcasts now since podcasts started, right? I was very, very early in terms of my podcast fandom. I still listen to, God, more podcasts than any wise man should. And I've got to tell you, the ad market out there is a race to the bottom. So here is my pledge to you. I will never read an ad on these podcasts. I'm never going to make you sit through a mattress, no matter how big the box is that it comes in, or any kind of promotion for a mail at home company, or an app that will restore your mental health. I promise not to make you do that. But in return, I ask that you head on over to patreon.com/nextword and pledge your support there so that we can just all have a nicer time and a happier life. How does that sound? Does that sound fair? And in exchange for that, you will also get bonus episodes. There are already a stack of bonus episodes over on the Patreon feed, and there will be, in terms of our Dracula unit, 2 more. The second, I am keeping secret. You might be able to guess if you followed me for a long time, because it's a movie that I've wanted to talk about. It's a story that I've wanted to talk about for a long time. And this is about the best opportunity I'm ever going to have. But the first movie that I'm going to cover is, of course, with inevitability, Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula. As an exercise in adaptation, I think it is really interesting. As a movie, it is more flawed, and as I've implied in the course of the last few episodes, I think I'm maybe not the world's biggest Coppola fan, particularly now, and I do think that the seeds of what he turned into as a filmmaker are absolutely evident in Bram Stoker's Dracula, but there's also a ton to love, and it is the most faithful adaptation that we're now ever likely to get, right? Dracula is now so commonplace that it's hard to imagine someone going back to the original text and trying to present it as carefully, as painstakingly as Coppola did, though that's not to say that even in 1992 he didn't make some wild changes to the text. So we're going to cover that over on the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. The other thing that I wanted to recommend for you is another podcast that I do, which also, by the way, doesn't have any ads in it. Don't You Know Me By Now is a podcast that I recently launched with the fabulous, intelligent, brilliant, witty, charming Elizabeth Ray, who is so great on this podcast, as we basically follow in the footsteps of our shared favorite romantic couple in cinema history, right? I'm talking, of course, about Jesse and Celine in Richard Linklater's Before trilogy. We have just spent 2 episodes covering the first 15 minutes or so of Before Sunrise. We're going to spend another hour this coming week talking about the next 8 minutes, where we stop on the bridge and then we get on the streetcar, on the tram there in Vienna. It's a really meandering kind of conversational approach to this kind of podcast discussion, while also diving deep into films that we sincerely love. So I hope you'll join me for that. That's Don't You Know Me By Now, a Next Word podcast, available at knowmepod.com, knowpod.com. That is going to do it for this week. Hopefully, we will return to our regularly scheduled live broadcast next Monday night. I have some tests that I can run between here and there. I'm now taking a local backup of these damn things, so hopefully you'll be able to join me for the live broadcast next Monday night, 8 p.m. Central. You will also be able to find the link to that over on the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, if you've enjoyed any of the podcasts I've done over the years, why not tell a friend that I'm still doing this and we're still working our way through Dracula, even though it's now the middle of November. You guys, we're doing the work. All right, that is going to do it for this week. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you all again very soon. As always, we promise you a hearty welcome and a loving greeting and a health as true as your own right hand. Thanks for listening. Good night.